Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction. Today we're taking a look at another Napoleon episode from Epic History TV. Today we are taking a look at the Battle of Wagram 1809.
An Epic History TV History March collaboration. In May 1809, the Austrians had defeated Napoleon's army in the bloody Battle of Aspern. His enemies took heart. After years of French military dominance, it seemed the tide was turning at last. 3 weeks later, Pope Pius VII excommunicated Napoleon for annexing papal land. Another propaganda coup for his enemies.
Yes, the papal excommunication of Napoleon was certainly a propaganda win for the Allies, especially for Catholic Austria, but in reality had little practical effect. In the past centuries, a papal excommunication would have been devastating for the reputation and legitimacy of a Catholic ruler like Napoleon. However, the papacy's power over the secular world had long since waned, and though it retained influence over spiritual affairs, this has also been diminished through the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. So this incident actually led one of Napoleon's subordinates, a very ambitious young man, to arrest Pope Pius. And, Napoleon did not actually approve of this, but nonetheless, he kept Pope Pius in house arrest right up until 1814. However, Napoleon was reconciled with the Catholic Church at his deathbed in 1821. So Napoleon had a very rocky relationship with the Catholic Church, but in the end, he remained a believer.
But in the wake of its victory, Austria hesitated, not sure whether to seek peace or continue the war, while Napoleon responded with a hurricane of activity.
Yes, this is typical for Napoleon. While other rulers dither and takes time to consider things and what's our next move and all that, Napoleon always knows the next move straight away. So that's his big advantage. He can move much more decisively than the others. And this is a factor that would remain true until the end of the war.
He summoned reinforcements to join him near Vienna. The Army of Italy, under his stepson Eugène de Beauharnais, and 11th Corps under Marshal Marmont.
Yes, Eugène was Napoleon's adopted son. He was actually in reality his stepson, because he was Josephine's child from another marriage. And he was in 1805 made a viceroy of Italy to govern the Kingdom of Italy on Napoleon's behalf. Napoleon actually never went back to Italy after his 1800 campaign, or 1805 coronation rather. And he was by all accounts an effective governor of Italy and a good general in his own right. However, yes, he was considered one of the most able subordinates of all of Napoleon's relatives. And actually many of his children became queens and princes and even empresses. One of his children became the Empress of Brazil, for example, to Emperor Pedro I. So yeah, that's an interesting tidbit. But yeah.
Who'd together driven Archduke John's Austrian army out of North Italy, as well as Marshal Bernadotte's Saxon 9th Corps. Napoleon's army grew from 90,000 to a massive 164,000 men and 544 guns to take on Charles's army of 128,000 and 414 guns. 6 weeks after his first attempt had ended in defeat, Napoleon ordered his army to cross the river once more. This time his engineers had built solid bridges across the Danube to ensure there was no repeat of the disasters of Aspern.
Yes, and if you remember, the Austrian had floated barges and heavy obstacle downriver to smash through his floating bridges he had constructed last time around. But this time around, he was prepared for it. And, you know, like the Romans of old, those engineers, those were the true unsung heroes of every army of this time. They accomplished many miracles throughout Napoleon's campaigns and many other campaigns from the Allied side, of course.
For the French army, Napoleon declared, the Danube no longer exists. The stage was set for the largest battle yet seen in European history. If you think our Napoleon series has made you a master of tactics and strategy, put your skills to the test in Vikings War of Clans, generous sponsors of this video. Napoleon's rules of concentration of force and decisive action will serve you well as you battle for dominance alongside up to 3 million other users in a single event. Any style of play, Berserk knows your and get a special bonus of 200 coins, Vikings War of Clans, for supporting this video.
It's a good job you're not any taller. Napoleon to a staff officer whose helmet was knocked off by a cannonball. That's what I call a close call.
On the evening of the 4th of July, in heavy rain, the French began crossing from the island of Lobau, not towards the devastated villages of Aspern and Essling, but east towards Groß-Enzersdorf, which was soon ablaze from French shells. Archduke Charles had left only a small advance guard to delay the French. By dawn, General Massena's 4th Corps and Oudinot's 2nd Corps were driving those troops back, winning space for the French army to deploy. At 1 p.m, Napoleon was ready to begin his advance across 6 miles of flat cornfields towards the main Austrian position, an escarpment known as the Wagram, 100 meters behind the Russbach stream. As General Lasalle's light cavalry and Massena's 4th Corps swung left to guard the flank, Oudinot's 2nd Corps and Davout's 3rd Corps advanced towards the Wagram. Bernadotte's Saxon Corps and Eugene's Army of Italy filled the center. At 6 p.m, unsure of the enemy's strength, Napoleon ordered a full-scale assault against the Wagram plateau. But his troops met determined Austrian resistance along the line. By dusk, the Saxon 9th Corps had pushed into the village of Deutsch Wagram. The Saxon infantry wore white uniforms, like the Austrians, and as darkness fell, were mistaken for the enemy and fired on by friendly units.
Yes, and friendly fire incidents were much more common than you might think, despite all of these brightly colored uniforms. This happened a lot. And the problem in this case is that the Saxons had actually done very well in Deutsch Wagram, pushing the Austrians out. And you have to remember that at this point, the Saxon 9th Corps is quite an inexperienced unit of the Grande Armée. But they did very well. However, when there's intense fighting, it tends to be much smoke, which reduced the visibility. In this case, in Deutsch Wagram, so the Austrians, the Saxons had very hard time distinguishing between Austrians and their own units, and they actually started firing on each other. And this led to chaos, of course, which meant a disorderly retreat.
The Saxons panicked and fled with heavy losses. Napoleon's attempt at a quick breakthrough had failed. That night, both armies slept in the open, while Charles and Napoleon planned their next moves. On the second day, Napoleon planned for Davout's 3rd Corps to lead the attack, rolling up the Austrian flank, while his other corps pinned down the enemy with local attacks. But to the Emperor's fury, he learned that overnight, without orders, Marshal Bernadotte had withdrawn his battered Saxons from Adderclar.
Yes, this decision has been much criticized, and fairly, I would say. However, there is some context to take into consideration here. When the Saxons broke after the friendly fire incidents, Bernadotte had a really hard time trying to rally his demoralized troops. And he actually had failed already during the night, failed to rally the vast majority of his troops at Adekla, which was his plan. So he took the initiative of abandoning Adekla during the night, and he hoped that by drawing closer to the main army, he would be more successful in rallying the remnants of the Saxon troops, which is a fair consideration. However, he did not tell the emperor about this, and it was quite irresponsible not to, tell anyone that he was doing this. And of course, like we're getting into here, this meant that the Austrians could occupy Adekla without a fight. Now, why did Bernadotte do this? It's unclear. He says it was on his own initiative, sure. But in reality, it probably has something to do with the fact that Bernadotte did not consider himself to be a subordinate to Napoleon. Not really. They were fierce rivals since the days of the Italian campaigns, and they had rivalries in love too. And yeah, it was just a mess of a personal relationship between these two men. They could not get along at all. And both of them would be well off to have a divorce, so to speak, and they would actually get this year. But that's another story.
Which the Austrians now occupied. Adderclar was a crucial strongpoint in the center of the battlefield. Napoleon gave orders for its immediate recapture. But the French and Saxon attack failed, with heavy losses. The Austrians had their own problems. Archduke Charles, knowing he faced a superior enemy, had decided his only chance of victory lay in an all-out dawn attack. He was relying on his brother, Archduke John, reaching him with 13,000 reinforcements, in time to support the attack on the left. But by dawn, there was still no sign of him.
And you might ask rightfully, where was Archduke John? Well, the thing is that Archduke Charles had sent a message to John telling him to bring up his reinforcement, leave his baggage train and all that behind, and just get here as quickly as possible. But due to heavy thunderstorms, the messenger was actually delayed by a full day. So yeah, this is the problem when you're not living in the age of instant communications. And his plan that they just presented here was good in theory. However, coordinating an attack on such a scale across those distances was very, very, very difficult. And it's a testament to Napoleon's genius that he was able to do this many times throughout his career.
What's more, as 4th Corps began its assault on Grosshofen, on time, 3rd Corps, which had received its orders late, was still getting into position, holding up the entire Austrian right wing. Charles had to tell 4th Corps to abort its unsupported attack until the other corps were ready. With the Austrians paralyzed by delays, at 10 a.m., Davout began his attack. A fierce infantry battle erupted in the village of Markgraf Neusiedl, while in the fields, dragoons and hussars fought a giant whirling cavalry battle as each side tried to outflank the other. Davout's corps took the village, though they couldn't stop the Austrians withdrawing to a strong new position on the Wagram escarpment. Meanwhile, a serious threat had developed to Napoleon's left flank and rear. Klenau's 6th Corps had driven back the outnumbered French, with some units advancing as far as Essling, dangerously close to Napoleon's vital river crossings. Napoleon urgently needed to reinforce his left flank, but he was also determined to hold back his reserves for a decisive attack. So he ordered Massena's 4th Corps to march across the battlefield and reinforce the left. A huge redeployment like this, right in front of the enemy, was high risk. So Marshal Bessieres was ordered to lead a cavalry attack straight against the enemy centre. Casualties were high. Even Marshal Bessieres had his horse killed under him, to the alarm of his men. But the enemy was kept busy, while 4th Corps completed its redeployment and forced Klenau's corps to fall back.
Yes, Marshal Bessieres' charge was not at all unusual in the sense that cavalry was often deployed to prevent enemy units from counterattacking. However, this was not a very efficient use of cavalry. It was supposed to be in a supporting role, especially in cleanup operations where they could really shine and chase enemy units and cut them down. But this was a effective strategy, however, very costly. Any trooper who isn't dead by 30 is a coward, and I don't anticipate exceeding that length of time. General Antoine Lassalle, killed at Wagram, aged 33.
Napoleon now assembled a grand battery of more than 80 cannon in the center of the battlefield. This was one of Napoleon's trademark tactics, the concentration of artillery to blast the enemy line and pave the way for a decisive French attack.
Yes, the Grand Battery was something that Napoleon came up with, and basically the idea behind the Grand Battery is to substitute volume of fire for accuracy, rate of fire, and rapid movement. And this tactic became more prevalent post-1808, when the general quality of artillery crews and their horses declined. And as such, you had to concentrate all of this artillery and, fire more shells at the enemy rather than being accurate. And the Grand Battery was often concentrated towards the center, enemy center. This would soften up their lines, or, in this case, prevent a counterattack from taking place. And of course, when you are using this tactic, you need enormous amounts of ammunition, and there are examples later in history, for example at Gettysburg, when I believe General Lee was unable to sustain his Grand Battery tactics because he lacked ammunition. So, it had to be used sparingly still, even though it became more common as time went on.
The Grand Battery fired an estimated 15,000 rounds, setting light to the cornfields. Around 1 p.m, Napoleon ordered a general attack. As Davout continued to batter at the enemy flank, 4th Corps would advance on the left, 2nd Corps on the right, while in the centre, General MacDonald would lead forward 8,000 men of the Army of Italy, formed up in a giant three-sided square.
Yes, this is a huge version of the so-called mixed order formation, and that meant combining both line and column formations, with the veteran soldiers taking their place in the line and the more inexperienced conscripts were in column formation. And this was a tactic that Napoleon often liked to employ. It was not his innovation, really. It was used in the Revolutionary Wars a lot because the soldiers were quite inexperienced. But yeah, this allowed you to have columns on the flanks that could charge due to the sheer weight of numbers, and they could also quickly form squares to repel cavalry attacks on the flanks. And the line would provide firepower. So it's an interesting combination where they are trying to get, best of both worlds. And this was considered a bit of a French specialty, as other nations didn't really employ it all that too often.
To secure his flanks.
I should say that the efficiency of this formation has been debated among military historians for quite some time now. It's not at all clear that this was more beneficial than just having straight column formations or line formations.
But despite the terrible French cannonade, Austrian Third Corps and Grenadiers of the Reserve met the French advance with torrential fire. MacDonald's giant square was cut to pieces, its men mowed down en masse by cannon fire, and the attack stalled. But the Austrian army, battered by relentless French attacks, was near breaking point. Every part of the line was under pressure from the French. Archduke Charles, determined above all to keep his army intact, ordered a retreat. The Austrian withdrawal was disciplined and well executed. Napoleon had his victory. But his army was also so shattered by fatigue and heavy losses, it was unable to launch any effective pursuit.
It's obvious that you were not at Wagram, Napoleon to minister who mocked the Austrians. I think this quote is great because it shows that Napoleon has learned a new respect for his enemy. He realizes that they are getting better, they have adapted. In many cases, just taking straight out of Napoleon's book and learning from him how to fight battles in this era.
The Battle of Wagram was a brutal slugging match, the biggest and bloodiest battle yet seen in European history. French victory came at unprecedented cost. An estimated 37,500 casualties against 41,500 Austrian.
Yes, these sort of casualty numbers would become more and more frequent post 1808. And why is this? Well, this is due to the fact that both sides are, of course, mobilizing even greater and greater armies, and due to the fact that many of the troops involved in these battles are raw conscripts, which are not capable of sustaining or using rather complex formations and tactics to win on the battlefield. They have to use more crude tactics that often result in higher casualties. For example, the column formations became more prevalent because it required a lot of training and experience to be able to keep a line formation straight during a battle. So yeah, these numbers are going to become very prevalent soon.
4 days later, French troops caught up with the retreating Austrians at Znaim. As the fighting escalated, Charles knew he could not withstand the French a second time and asked for a ceasefire. But he had not consulted his older brother, Emperor Francis, who was furious when he heard the news, not least because long-awaited British support was finally on the way. 3 weeks after the Battle of Znaim, the largest amphibious force Britain had ever assembled, 35 ships of the line and 39,000 troops, landed at Walcheren Island on the Scheldt estuary. Its aim was to destroy French shipping and naval stores. But following the successful bombardment and capture of Vlissingen, British commanders let the initiative slip from their grasp. Their force was bottled up by French troops on the marshy Dutch coast, where it was decimated by fever and dysentery.
Yes, the Walcheren campaign was an interesting amphibious expedition by the British, and it was quite a serious attempt to land some troops here in the Kingdom of Holland. But unfortunately, there was a lot of British bungling during this campaign, and it was not helped by the fact that Marshal Bernadotte was appointed the commander of the French forces in this region, and his appointment led to some much needed unity of command among the French forces, and he also reorganized the French forces and train them. And as such, this, combined with the aforementioned British bungling, led to the expedition being called off rather prematurely.
About 4,000 died. Many more became permanent invalids. The survivors were evacuated back to England in December. Emperor Francis, informed of the British debacle and persuaded by his generals that Austria couldn't fight on, made peace with Napoleon. In October, Austria signed the Treaty of Schönbrunn, giving up territory to the French Empire, Bavaria, Saxony, the Duchy of Warsaw, and Russia. In total, the Austrian Empire was stripped of 3.5 million subjects, forced to pay an indemnity, limit its army to 150,000 men, and join Napoleon's continental system, which meant ending all trade with British ships and merchants. Archduke Charles.
Yes, the Treaty of Schönbrunn also included the fact that Austria had to recognize Napoleon's conquests from other nations, and Austria also had to recognize Joseph Bonaparte as the legitimate king of Spain. And of course, this was a devastating peace treaty for Austria, where they completely lost access to the Adriatic. And yeah, they lost a lot of subjects, which means a lot of lost tax revenue. And of course, there comes the usual indemnity, which was pretty large. And their army was limited in size. Now, that particular promise the Austrians did not keep. And despite this treaty, Austria remained a great power in Europe. And that would come back to bite Napoleon.
Meanwhile, one of Napoleon's more skilled opponents had fallen out so bitterly with his brother, Emperor Francis, that he never held active command again.
Also, another thing is the fact that during the negotiations at the palace at Schönbrunn, Napoleon actually narrowly escaped being assassinated by a 17-year-old German who was the son of a Lutheran pastor, and he was only saved thanks to the intervention of his longtime aide, General Rapp, who caught wind of this pretty early on and moved to prevent it. And Napoleon asked the assassin whether he would be thankful if Napoleon pardoned him, but the man said that he would still want to kill Napoleon, and as such, this led to his execution by firing squad almost immediately. So
Napoleon had won another crushing victory, but there were worrying signs for the French emperor. His enemies were learning, while he would increasingly have to rely on young conscripts to fill the gaps left by veterans killed or wounded on campaign. Few could have guessed in 1809, but Napoleon had just fought his last victorious campaign.
Yes, even though Aspern had put a bit of a dent in Napoleon's reputation for invincibility, the fact remained that Napoleon won this campaign, and there weren't many people in Europe at the time that actually believed that this would be the last successful campaign by Napoleon. So yeah, and I think we're coming up at the end of the video. Yes, so thank you for watching, and if you have anything to add, please leave a comment. And until the next time, I'll see you then. Bye.